In March of 1095, Pope Urban II completed a tour of France and Italy by holding council in Piacenza in Lombardy. Here, ambassadors from the Byzantine Emperor Alexius Comnenus appealed to the Pope for Western military carry aid. The Seljuk Turks had seized control of most of Anatolia and were on the doorstep of Constantinople. It's hard to discern precisely what Alexius hoped to gain from his appeal to the Pope. Alexius' daughter Anna Comnena in her chronicle. The Alexiad says nothing about her father requesting aid from the West, and instead treats the First Crusade as a spontaneous movement initiated by the Latin. However, Anna wrote in the mid-12th century, and she may have purposely tried to distance her father from Latin policy. It's possible that the delegation at Piacenza was there more on routine, as part of the emperor's ongoing efforts to recruit Latin warriors into his service. But it's also possible that Alexius meant to take advantage of Western military resources in a large and serious push against the Seljuks. The Council of Piacenza is often viewed as the moment when Pope Urban decided to launch the First Crusade. However, Jonathan Riley Smith points out that the idea of a military expedition sent to aid Byzantium had likely been developing in the Pope's mind for years. Highly learned, broad-minded, individual Pope Urban recognized historical ties binding Rome and Constantinople, and throughout his papacy strove to bring the two closer together. One of his first acts as Pope was to lift the Latin Church's excommunication on Alexius at the Council of Melfi in 1089. He established friendly correspondence with both the Byzantine Emperor and the Patriarch of Constantinople. Relations between the Latin and Greek churches warmed. Piacenza also was not the first time the Byzantine Emperor had appealed to Latin Christendom for martial support only a few years earlier. Alexius had asked the Pope to send troops to fight the Pechenegs in the Balkans. As mentioned earlier, Alexius himself was no stranger to working with Latin Christians. In 1086, Alexius had met with Robert, the first Count of Flanders, who is coming back from pilgrimage to Jerusalem. Alexius had shown Robert much hospitality, and the two even embarked together on a campaign against the Seljuks. Constantinople had a sizable population of Western Europeans, but the emperor's own bodyguard, the Varanians, made up of elite Scandinavian warriors. Pope Urban II recognized how a serious response to this appeal was the natural next step in the papacy's drive to assert its spiritual authority in the wake of the invested Your controversy following Pope Gregory VII expulsion from Rome in 1084. As a result of his conflict with the Holy Roman Emperor, the papacy had been in a weakened state. Now at Piacenza, Urban vividly exercised papal power. As historian Christopher Tyrement says, sitting in judgment on the state of the Church and the morals of the clergy, and debating the sins of emperors and kings, specifically the conduct of Henry IV of Germany and the adultery of Philip I of France. A call to aid the Greeks against the Seljuk Turks would be yet another confident demonstration of papal strength. After the Council of Piacenza in March 1095, Pope Urban II began planning the expedition that would be known to history as the First Crusade. He made an elaborate tour of France, the first pope to do so in half a century, which was to culminate in the Council of Clermont in November. To be attended by 13 archbishops, 82 bishops, and a large number of abbots and other clergymen. These church leaders would hail from the Anglo-Norman realms in the north, to northern Austria in the east, to Italy in the south. The Pope's tour covered the bulk of southern, central, western, and southeastern France. Each stop featured mass assemblies and preaching, all designed to convey the gravity of the event. Urban avoided areas under the direct control of the King of France, who was to be excommunicated at Clermont for adultery everywhere. The Pope went. There was great excitement over his presence. There is strong evidence to indicate that prior to the Council of Clermont, the Pope met with Ramon, the fourth Count of Toulouse, one of the wealthiest lords in all of Europe. Ramon had campaigned in the Iberian Peninsula alongside Alfonso VI of Leon and Castile, who had granted Ramon his daughter Elvira in marriage, deeply pious and experienced in the wars against the Moors in Spain. Ramon was a natural ally to the Pope in his plans for a military campaign against the Seljaks in the east. Ramon himself likely knew the details of Urban's plan before Clermont, and probably also committed to involve himself in the cause during his private talks with the Pope. The Pope also met with an important bishop of Ramon's domains, Adamor of Le Puy, who was designated spiritual head of the Crusade. Additionally, the Pope consulted the Bishop of Cahors, the Archbishop of Lyon, and the Abbot of Cluny, as well as the cardinals and Italian clergymen traveling with him, one of whom was Deinbert, Archbishop of Pisa, destined to be elected Patriarch of Jerusalem in 1099. Clergymen were asked to encourage the local knights and nobility to travel to Clermont for the council in November. There is even a long-running legend that the first Crusader vows were made in October at a meeting in Burgundy. In examining Pope Urban's planning and travels throughout 1095 leading up to the Council of Clermont, it's clear that the Pope had a meticulous plan in mind that had been in development for much of his papacy. In some ways, the idea was forming long before Urban's election as Pope. The popes had been concerned about the disintegration of Christendom's eastern frontier for some time. In 1074, news of westward Turkish incursions had caused Pope Gregory VII to propose leading personally an army of some 50,000 Christians to, quote, liberate their brothers in the east. Urban's goal was far more ambitious: to mobilize the resources of Christendom's military class under the command of important rulers like Ramon IV of Toulouse, with the intent of bringing support to the Byzantines and liberating Jerusalem. Even before 1095, many of Europe's major noblemen and clergymen were already aware of the plan. Now, all that was left was to make the major announcement in the fall. At Clermont, Pope Urban, the second tour of France in 1095, culminated with the Council of Clermont, which began on November 18th. Most of the high-ranking attendees were churchmen, abbots, and bishops. The council dealt with an array of ecclesiastical issues: church organization, Simone celibacy, lay investiture, as well as the excommunication of King Philip I of France for refusing to maintain his relationship with his queen and openly keeping a mistress in her place. Finally, it was announced that on Tuesday, November 27th, the Pope would address the public to make a great announcement. A crowd gathered in response so large that it could not be hosted within the cathedral. A platform was raised on the field before the city gate. Here Urban made his speech. 5 versions of the Pope's speech survive to this day while they are not identical. They agree, for the most part, on the ideas breathed by the Pope. In essence, he called on the Knights of Europe to engage in a war of liberation. Eastern Christians were abused and humiliated by the Seljuk Turks, and it was the Christian duty of their Western brethren to help them, regardless of the costs involved. Constantinople was emphasized the rallying point for the Western forces, with the idea that the Crusade would join forces with the Emperor Alexius and aid him in repulsing the Turks and winning back his territory. But Alexius was not the only Lord. Urban encouraged the knights to help. Christ himself was to be given aid by this expedition. The Pope highlighted Jerusalem and the Holy Land as the inheritance of Christ on earth, and urged Western Christians to win back territory that lawfully belonged to him. In this way, Urban, born of the knightly class himself, spoke to the European nobility in terms that were deeply meaningful to them. Soldiers of Christ, it was their duty to fight for his lands, just as a vassal must fight to defend the lands of his feudal lord. Jerusalem had long been an objective veneration and pilgrimage for Western Christians in a society that prized relics. The Holy Sepulchre, the site of Christ's death and resurrection, was the ultimate relic. From medieval Latins, contact with the Holy Sepulchre provided a means of powerful connectedness to Christ, the most sacred site on earth. The Pope proclaimed must not remain in the hands of infidels. It must be procured by Christians so that it could receive due honor. Pope Urban must have been a remarkable speaker. His words moved the masses gathered at Clermont, and soon the air was filled with men shouting, Deus vult, God wills it. Adhemar, the Bishop of Le Puy, came forward and became the first man to receive the cross, that is, take the pledge to go on crusade, and many others followed his example. One of our most important eyewitness accounts of the First Crusade is the Gest of Francorum, written anonymously by a follower of Bowman of Taranto, possibly a knight, the author of the Gest. I was not present at the Council of Clermont, but he opens his chronicle with an account of the Pope's speech, which he must have compiled from the oral accounts of other crusaders who had heard the Pope's words. This version of Urban's speech is quite interesting because it gives us an idea of how the Pope's call to crusade was perceived by a fairly ordinary participant. The Gest records the Pope's words as follows: "Whoever wishes to save his soul should not hesitate humbly to take up the way of the Lord. And if he lacks sufficient money, divine mercy will give him enough. Brethren, we ought to endure much suffering for the name of Christ. Misery, poverty, nakedness, persecution, want, illness, hunger, thirst, and the other ills of this kind. Just as the Lord saith to his disciples, you must suffer much in my name, and be not ashamed to confess me before the faces of men. Verily, I will give you mouth and wisdom. And finally, great is your reward in heaven." The Gest version emphasizes the sacrificial aspect of the crusade, the idea that it was a great trial undertaken out of devotion to Christ and a desire to gain heaven. This flies in the face of the incorrect idea held by some that most crusaders were motivated out of material greed and not out of spirituality. In fact, the deep spiritual motivations behind the First Crusade are evident everywhere in the primary sources we possess. If the Gest was indeed written by an ordinary soldier or knight, it's a fascinating glimpse into the religious convictions of such a person. Another important eyewitness chronicler of the First Crusade was Fulcav Chartres, a priest who served as chaplain to Baldwin of Boulogne and lived out his days in the early Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem. Fulcav, who also offers an account of Pope Urban's speech, emphasizes the crusade as an act of love performed by Westerners to aid Eastern Christians offering under Seljuk rule, for your brethren who live in the East are in urgent need of your help, and you must hasten to give them aid which has often been promised them, for, as most of you have heard, the Turks and Arabs have attacked them and have conquered the territory of Romania as far west as the shore of the Mediterranean, and the Hellas spawn, which is called the arm of St. George. They have occupied more and more of the lands of those Christians and have overcome them in 7 battles. They have killed and captured many and have destroyed the churches and devastated the empire. If you permit them to continue, the faithful of God will be much more widely attacked by them on this account. I, or rather, the Lord, beseech you as Christ heralds to publish this everywhere, and to persuade all people of whatever rank, foot, soldiers and knights, poor and rich, to carry aid promptly to those Christians. I say this to those who are present. It is meant also for those who are absent. Moreover, Christ commands it full. Care's account also includes the plenary indulgence promised by the Pope to Crusaders, all who die by the way, whether by land or by sea, or in battle against the pagans, shall have immediate remission of sins. Pope Urban. The Second Crusade was carefully organized, and he expected participants to adhere to his instructions. Potential crusaders were to get approval from their local clergy, and they were to join one of the armies, led by a great lord such as Ramon IV of Toulouse or Godfrey of Bouillon, who had received the cross from Urban's preachers, but not everyone obeyed the Pope's commands. Some bands of renegade crusaders, mostly made up of the desperately poor, struck out on their own wild, lawless excursions in the spring and summer of 1096. Armies from northern France, southern France, Italy, and the Holy Roman Empire were busy preparing to depart for the East in response to Pope Urban's appeal. But some of Europe's poor rejected the idea of following a great lord or submitting to the Pope's terms and schedule. Thomas Madden summarizes it well. Too many, the extensive preparations of the church and the nobility for the crusade seem not only superfluous, but also faithless. If Christ's soldiers marched the Holy Land, would he not scatter the infidel Turks, as he had the Philistines long ago? One man in particular advocated this view, Peter the Hermit, a ragged holy man who rode from town to town on a donkey, mesmerizing crowds with his fiery preaching. Contrary to popular belief, Peter the Hermit was most likely not asked to preach the crusade by Pope Urban. Thomas Asbridge states that Peter was, quote, most likely not endorsed by the papacy. Peter's preaching seemed to have something divine about it, though Guibert of Notion, a chronicler of the First Crusade, would, quote, not report this as true, and attributed this reputation to, quote, the common people who love novelties. Although Peter attracted large throngs of peasants into his company, Jonathan Riley Smith points out that we should not believe that these forces consisted only of peasants. There were some knights among them, some of whom ended up eventually joining the military elite of the Crusade estates, but nevertheless Thomas Asbridge says that the People's Crusade was a, quote, largely uncontrollable ramshackle horde by the time he left France in April 1096 and headed to Cologne. A considerable train of disciples trailed Peter, and in Germany as well he attracted even more. While the real Crusades still prepared, Peter's horde drifted eastward, poorly provisioned and short on cash. The Crusaders quickly turned hungry. Pillaging was common as they crossed into the Byzantine Empire. The Byzantine Emperor Alexius Comnenus was shocked when he heard reports of this mob descending upon his lands at once. He arranged for them to be supplied with provisions to put an end to their thieving. When Peter arrived in Constantinople, he met another Westerner who had traveled east with a motley following. Walter, sense of war, a minor, but experienced knight. Like Peter's group, Walter's throngs, which included only 8 knights, had plundered on their way, coming to blows with the forces of King Coleman of Hungary. Both were interviewed by Alexius, who was, according to Thomas Madden, impressed by Peter's abilities. As an order, Alexius convinced Peter and Walter that they should await the arrival of the papally sanctioned Crusader forces. But the peasant armies were not convinced. Despite the protests of Peter and Walter, the People's Army crossed the Bosporus on August 6th, entering Turkish territory. The People's Army was without a plan and without means of fighting. Peter returned to Constantinople to try to gain additional aid from Alexius. Meanwhile, in Asia Minor, Kili Arslan, the Seljuk Sultan of Rum, dispatched forces to intercept the peasants' army. Walter himself fell in the slaughter back in Constantinople. Peter received word of what had happened and settled in to await the arrival of the true Crusader armies. The People's Crusade is a bizarre and tragic incident. It cannot be considered a part of the First Crusade proper, since it was conducted outside of the papally sanctioned expedition. In his speech at Clermont, Pope Urban had emphasized that the poor and inexperienced should not be participating in his crusade. In essence, the People's Crusade was everything Pope Urban had sought to avoid. Fortunately, his careful planning did ensure that the crusade proper was free. The chaos surrounding the People's Crusade, the main armies of the First Crusade, mobilized between December 1095 and August of 1096, adhering to the schedule laid out by Pope Urban II. The Pope's directives called for the Crusaders to make their way toward the Byzantine capital of Constantinople, where they would unite under the leadership of Emperor Alexius Comnenus, who would then guide them in a campaign of reconquest against the Seljuk Turkish rulers of the Levant. First to depart in August was the brother of King Philip I of France, Hugh, the first Count of Vermont, Noir, leading a small army provided both by himself and by his brother, the king. Sailing from Italy, Hugh's fleet foundered on the Dalmatian coast, and the Count had to be rescued by Byzantine officials who brought him to Constantinople to meet Emperor Alexius. Toward the end of August, departed Godfrey of Bouillon, Duke of Lower Lorraine. In later centuries, Godfrey would become the central figure in the mythology of the First Crusade, idealized as the perfect Christian knight. However, prior to taking the cross, he had been at odds with the papacy, a vassal to Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV. He'd even participated in the siege of Rome, which drove out Pope Gregory VII in 1084. The fact that Godfrey answered the call to the cross demonstrates the power of Pope Urban's message, but also alludes to the complexity of late 11th century politics. Was Godfrey's opposition to the Pope at any time any deeper than loyalty to his own Lord William of Tyre? Tells us that Godfrey was tall, powerful, and billed with a beard and hair of blonde. In a charter struck before his departure, Godfrey's mother said he was, quote, preparing to fight for God in Jerusalem. Godfrey was joined on the crusade by his older brother, Eustace, the third Count of Bologna, and their younger brother, Baldwin of Bologna. Dark-haired and taller than his brothers, Baldwin had originally been destined for the church, but his love of the knightly lifestyle prompted him to change careers before ordination. However, he'd received the literary education common to clerics at the time, and all his life had an intellectual bent to his personality. Jonathan Riley Smith says he was an intelligent, calculating and ruthless man. He was not pleasant, but his strength of personality and quickness of mind were to be of great value to the Crusaders without any lands or wealth of his own. Baldwin took service as one of Godfrey's high-ranking knights, but he had his heart set on winning a lordship of his own with a considerable army of Walloon and Lotharingian knights behind him. Godfrey marched through Germany. His men passed in perfect peace and order through Hungary, where King Coleman was understandably nervous after the antics of the People's Crusade. By December, Godfrey came within sight of Constantinople and laid down camp outside the city near the head of the Golden Horn Bowmen of Taranto. Was the most experienced military commander of the First Crusade. His martial skills had been honed in the Norman wars against the Byzantines. A hugely tall, powerfully built man, Bowman is described by Anna Karenina as perfectly proportioned with a hard, savage quality to his whole aspect, and that even his laugh sounded like a threat. In 1090, Devon Bowman was in the process of besieging Amalfi, which had rebelled against his uncle Count Roger, the first of Sicily, when he encountered Crusaders on their way to the East. Beaumont, whose family was closely allied to Pope Urban II, was so impressed by these men that he at once took the cross himself, gathering around him a small but powerful force of Norman warriors, and set out for Constantinople. Meanwhile, Godfrey of Bouillon was camped outside of the Byzantine capital with his men. Although Pope Urban had insisted that the Crusaders would find an Emperor Alexius, a trustworthy ally, eager to join them in the fight against the Turks, Godfrey knew that Hugh Vermandois was being held a virtual prisoner inside of Constantinople and was hesitant to put himself in the Emperor's power by entering the royal palace. But Alexius refused to allow Godfrey to cross the Bosporus until he'd come before him to swear loyalty. There were a few tense moments, but Alexius finally agreed to provide hostages to the Crusaders while Godfrey entered the palace. Godfrey's chronicler, Albert of Orcan, says that Alexius declared Godfrey, quote, an adopted son. Godfrey swore loyalty to the emperor, and the emperor promised to provide to the Crusaders. By January 20th of 1097, Godfrey's army crossed the prosperous Bowmen, showed up at Constantinople in April. Anna Karenina tells us that Alexius was deeply anxious about Bowman's presence, since in the past the Italian Normans had invaded Byzantine lands. But Bowman, conducting himself with perfect courtly decorum, presented himself as utterly loyal to Alexius, gladly swearing fealty to him, an oath which Alexius did not believe the Norman intended to keep. The emperor was convinced that Bowman meant to use the Crusades as some kind of opportunity to conquer Byzantine lands. About the same time that Bowman appeared at Constantinople, Robert II, Count of Flanders, a man of considerable military prowess and piety, arrived with his army. A charter of Count Robert states that he was, quote, going to Jerusalem on the authority of the Apostolic See to liberate the Church of God, which had been trampled underfoot by savage peoples for a long time. His Flemish warriors would prove to be a valuable asset. In the course of the Crusade, next to arrive in Constantinople was Raymond, the fourth Count of Toulouse, with his large, splendidly equipped southern French army, as well as the papal legate, the Shabbatamar of Le Puy. Raymond met with Alexius in April. According to Anna Komnena, the emperor had a deep affection for Raymond and was impressed by the superior intellect, his untarnished reputation, the purity of his life. Anna says that Alexius and Raymond engaged in long discussion with one another, and then the emperor, quote, unreservedly opened the doors of his soul to the count. Already enormously well, Thomas Madden says that Raymond had decided to finish his life in the service of God, having personally discussed the crusade with Pope Urban. Raymond was keen to see Alexius commit himself as fully to the cause as the Western princes. Raymond's chronicler, Anne Chaplin, says that when Alexius asked Raymond to take an oath of loyalty to him, Raymond responded that he would gladly do so if Alexius would also take the cross and lead his army to the liberation of the Holy Land. Alexius insisted that he wanted very much to do so, but that he could not leave Constantinople. At this time, Pope Urban's entire project had been predicated on the idea that Eastern and Western Christianity would be gloriously united in brotherly bonds against the Saracens. Anna Kamina says her father would have loved to join in the war against the Turks, but that he feared the Latins would betray him to compensate. Alexius promised to supply the Crusaders with provisions, troops, and guides. Raymond, unwilling to bend on this issue, would not swear an oath of loyalty to Alexius, but instead took an oath simply to respect Alexius's territories. The emperor was satisfied with this and permitted Raymond to cross the Bosporus and joined Godfrey and Bowman for the advance on Nicaea. The final Latin army to arrive in Constantinople was that of the northern French LED by William the Conqueror's eldest son, Robert Curthos, Duke of Normandy, and his brother-in-law Stephen, the second Count of Blue, Curthos, and Stephen were warmly received by Alexius and were much impressed by his wealth and generosity. They eagerly swore loyalty to him, then continued on their way to complete the Crusader army, besieging Nicaea on May the 6th, 1097. The armies of the First Crusade reached Nicaea, an ancient city on the northwestern edge of Asia Minor, situated on the eastern shore of the Ashcanyon Lake. It's only a short journey from Constantinople, opposite the Bosporus, and is the gateway to Anatolia from the west. Currently, Nicaea was in the hands of the Seljuk Turks, acting as the capital of the Sultanate of Rum. The reduction of Nicaea would open the way for the Crusaders' long journey to the Holy Sepulchre and allow the Byzantines to establish a base in Asia Minor, from which further reconquest could be made. In the region, the Gest of Francorum, written by one of Bowman's men, says that on the day of the Ascension of the Lord, we began to attack the city on all sides and to construct machines of wood and wooden towers with which we might be able to destroy towers on the walls, Kelly Arklong. The Sultan of Rome was campaigning on his eastern frontier when he heard reports of the Crusader army besieging his capital. Assembling his forces, he marched on Nicaea on May 21st. Absalom moved up from the south and immediately launched an attack meant to break the siege. The army of Raymond of Toulouse bore the brunt of the assault, but the Crusaders handled the situation well, maintaining their blockade of the city while also dispatching troops to engage the Turks. A decisive cavalry charge, led by Godfrey and Bowman, smashed the Turkish forces, sending Kili Arkalan into full retreat. So the Celts won a glorious victory, wrote Emperor Alexia's daughter, Princess Anna, using her favorite term for Westerners. Celts, the guest says, our men hurled the heads of the killed far into the city that the Turks might be more terrified there. And abandoned by Kiliar, Sloane, the Turks of Nice. Sia sent messengers to Alexis, offering to surrender. The emperor sent his agents into Nice, Sia, to negotiate the transfer of the city to Byzantine power. On June 18th, Alexius excluded the Crusaders from this process. But afterwards, according to Fulcar of Chartres, the emperor, quote, ordered gifts to be presented to our leaders, gifts of gold and silver and raiment, and to the foot soldiers he distributed copper coins. Historian Thomas Asbridge says that the siege of Nicaea was a largely collaborative venture in which Latins and Greeks cooperated effectively, and the Crusaders willingly fought for the Byzantine Empire. Nicaea restored to Christian rule. The way was open for the Crusaders to make the long march east across Asia Minor, to act as advisors to the Franks. Alexius assigned a small Byzantine contingent, led by Toticios, an experienced half-Arab, half-Greek general who had lost his nose in an earlier battle, wore a gold prosthetic in its place. Although this was not the large-scale support the Franks had wanted from Alexius, they were undetermined, and by June 29th, were on the move, having captured Nice. Sia, the Crusaders began a long march eastward across the vast, sun-scorched territory of Anatolia. It was summer in Asia Minor, and the heat was brutal and unrelenting. Were still the Sultan Kili. Arklan had ravaged the territory, burning crops into spoiling water sources, in hopes of halting the Crusaders' advance. To reduce supply problems, the Latin princes divided their armies, with the first body, led by the Normans Bowman and Robert Curdos, and the second marching a day behind. Under Raymond of Toulouse and Godfrey Beaujean during the march, Bowman's spies informed him that Kiliar Sloane lay ahead with his army preparing an ambush on the evening of June 30th, as his forces approached the ruined Byzantine town of Dorilam. Bowman ordered the infantry to pitch a defensive camp at a stream and organized his cavalry for battle. On the morning of July 1st, Arklan struck, but Bowman was ready. Swarms of Turkish horsemen descended upon the Christian camp. Bowman and Robert Curtos made several charges, but the light, swift Turkish cavalry eluded them, wheeling away when attacked, then sweeping back in to harass the Crusaders. With arrows, things quickly went bad for the Christians. They were losing men and horses, and even the unarmed pilgrims hunkered down in the camp were being killed. A lesser commander might have panicked, but Bowman reacted instantly and effectively immediately changed tactics, ordering his Nice to dismount and stand with the infantry in a tight shield wall encircling the camp, allowing them to protect the horses, supplies, and pilgrims inside. This worked. Suddenly the Turks had to move in nearer to harass the Crusaders, who held their ground, and began to kill Turks. Venturing too close for several hours, the Crusader knights and foot soldiers stood side by side in this cramped formation, unbreakable. Before the increasingly desperate Turkish assault, the heat was intense. The air choked with dust. Women in the camp trudged back and forth from the stream, carrying buckets of water to the men on the lines. This deadlock was broken with the arrival of the Second Crusader Army cotton-wares. Killy Arslan had no time to react. Godfrey and Raymond led their cavalries in a charge that scattered the Turks. Kelly Arslan's army retreated. The Crusaders had won a great victory, though narrowly. The Battle of Dory Lam demonstrated Bowman's top-notch capabilities as a general for one. He'd known that the enemy attack was coming and chose a well-watered site for camp. Finally, at a desperate moment, he had organized his troops in such a way that allowed them to hold until reinforcements arrived. The victory also demonstrated the effectiveness of the Frankish cavalry charge, well executed by Raymond and Godfrey. But the Seljuk Turks had also performed quite well, and their swift harassing tactics had proven very effective despite the ultimate results of the battle. The Turks left behind the whole of their camp filled with gold and silks, horses and weapons, which the Crusaders immediately seized. Kelly Arslan abandoned his city of Iconium and retreated deep into the interior of Anatolia, hoping now to avoid the Christians as they moved across Asia Minor. After they subdued the Seljuk Sultan of Rum, the armies of the First Crusade spent 4 months journeying across the rest of Anatolia. They dispatched 2 small reconnaissance forces ahead of them, one under Godfrey of Bojan's younger brother, Baldwin of Bologna, and another under Bowman's nephew, Tancred. Baldwin and Tancred established contacts in Cilicia with local Armenians. This helped to secure a safe route through the mountainous territory on the northern approach to Syria. Baldwin of Bologna rejoined the main army in Marash. In October 1097, he found his wife Godvera seriously ill. She died before the month's end. Whether or not Baldwin grieved, he was composed enough to approach his brother Godfrey about a new project. Baldwin had learned from his Armenian contacts that there were Christian cities in Mesopotamia, eager for a strong lord to protect them from the Turks. Godfrey agreed with his brother's plan to establish a Frankish state in Mesopotamia, which would provide a reliable source of supplies for the raiders during their coming campaign in Syria. With Godfrey's blessing, Baldwin departed the main army with a small battalion of knights. Since he had given up his studies for the priesthood, Baldwin had served as his brother's knight, but he had larger ambitions and now seemed poised to achieve them. On entering Mesopotamia, he quickly captured the Turkish-held towns of Ravendel and Turbasol. Baldwin's success attracted the notice of Thoros Armenian, Lord of Odessa, who feared a coup from his subjects, since he could not protect the city from raids by his Turkish neighbor. Baldrish of Samosata. Thoros offered Baldwin an alliance, and Baldwin gladly accepted. In February 1098, Baldwin crossed the Euphrates and entered Odessa to cheering crowds of Armenians. By now, Baldwin was reputed as a victorious leader, and the locals were eager for a champion. So enthusiastically was Baldwin welcomed that Thoros decided to make him his adopted son. In a strange ritual, Baldwin and Thoros stripped to the waist and embraced one another publicly, while a long shirt was placed over them both to seal their new status as father and son. Baldwin next set out with his men to neutralize the threat of Baldrich of Samosata. He established a castle near to Samosata, which could check any Turkish raids on his return to Odessa. Baldwin discovered that a group of Armenian noblemen were plotting to kill Thoros and elevate Baldwin as sole ruler. Baldwin appears to have been unwilling to prevent this plot from going through, and was very likely at least passively complicit in it. Thoros was seized by a mob of Odessans who stabbed him to death in the streets. Baldwin of Bologna now ruled a powerful state centered around Odessa. He had risen to power through martial prowess and ruthless political intrigue. But he would prove to be the strong leader the Odessans desired, making their city powerful again and neutralizing the threat of neighboring Turks soon. He captured Samosata and his new state. The county of Odessa would straddle the Euphrates for half a century. Baldwin established close bonds with the Armenians, marrying an Armenian woman and employing Armenians as knights governors and advisors in the late summer of 1097. The Crusaders entered northern Syria, making their way toward the ancient city of Antioch. Secured by massive curtain walls set with 400 towers, Antioch was considered impregnable. Overwhelmingly, Antioch was populated by Christians, Armenians, Greeks, and Syrians. The Arab chronicler Ibn al-Athir says that Yaghi-Sin, the city's Turkish governor, worried when he heard of the approaching Frankish army that Antioch's Christians would side with their co-religious. So he sent the Christian men outside of the city wall to dig a moat. They labored on until the evening. But when they wished to enter the city, Yaghi-Sin prevented them and said, "You can leave me Antioch until I see how things will be with us and the Franks." It was October 1097 when the vanguard of the Crusader army arrived before Antioch. The anonymous author of The Guest of Front Coram, who was a follower of Beaumont, writes that we established a strict blockade on 3 gates of the city, for we could not besiege it from the other side, because a mountain high and very steep stood in our way. Indeed, the Crusaders concentrated their efforts on the northwestern quarter of the city, which gave them access to the Iron Bridge and the river boom, and placed his army before the St. Paul Gate. The northern French, under Robert Curthose, Robert of Flanders, Hugh of Vermont, Noir, and Stephen of Noir, cover the section of wall just anti-clockwise of Beaumont's, Raymond of Toulouse, and the southern French blockaded the Dog Gate, while Godfrey of Bouillon, Lotharingians and Germans covered the gate of the Duke Tatikios, and the Byzantines camped some distance away from the walls, presumably to act in support of the Franks. You can see from this diagram how much of Antioch could not be blockaded, including the wall running up into the forested Mount Silpius to the east and the portion of the wall that hugged the river on the southern end. In the opening months of the siege, the Crusaders sparred with the Turks on the wall's full care of Chartres says that the Crusaders found a number of boats in the Alpha Said River. These they took and fashioned into a pontoon bridge over which they crossed to carry out their plans. This bridge of boats was strategically crucial since it allowed the Crusaders to quickly access the plain southwest of Antioch, which the Turks initially used as a staging ground for armed sorties. From the city, the Frankish leaders also dispatched squadrons into the surrounding countryside to take control of the nearby castles, such as Haram, for the purpose of denying Yaghi-Sin and control of Antioch's territory. By mid-November, winter cold was setting in, and the Crusaders had to send foraging expeditions farther and farther from the city in search of food, now grain, and all food began to be excessively dear. Before the birthday of the Lord says, "The guest of Francarum Cold and hungry, the Crusaders celebrated Christmas in their damp, ramshackle camp, seeking sustenance in their faith and in the thought that beyond Antioch lay the object of their longing, the holy city of Jerusalem. 3 days after Christmas, Bowman himself, along with Count Robert A. Flanders, LED, a small force of knights into Antioch's hinterland in search of provisions. During their journey, the foragers were surprised by a Turkish army sent from Damascus to relieve Antioch. The Turks instantly fell upon the Crusaders, but Bowman and the Count of Flanders quickly organized their men into a solid defensive formation, while the Count of Flanders LED a direct attack on the Turkish cavalry. Bowman moved his Normans into a flanking position that prevented the Turks from surrounding Count Robert's knights in the confusion of the battle. The Turks retreated. Although Bowman lost a sizable amount of men, he did manage to prevent the Turkish force from bringing aid to Antioch. Unfortunately for the Crusaders, Bowman and his foragers managed to cure only modest provisions as the year came to a close. The Crusaders had made little progress in the siege of Antioch and remained huddled outside the massive city walls with little hope of ever breaking through them. The first months of 1098 were cold and miserable in the Crusader camp before the walls of Antioch. Food was scarce illness common, and little progress had been made in reducing the enormous ancient city. On the Orontes, desertions from the army's rank and file became a problem. Even Peter the Hermit and William the Carpenter, the former leaders of the People's Crusade, snuck away and tried to flee in the night. But they were caught by Bowman's nephew Tancred, who dragged them back to his uncle's tent to face the wrath of the giant Norman. Almost evil of all whom the earth endures, why did you so violently flee? Was it perchance for the reason that you wished to betray these knights? And the host of Christ, Peter and William, begged Bowman to be merciful, and ultimately he did pardon them. But a far more serious desertion occurred by the end of January, when the Byzantine general Taticios departed. With the Greek contingent, Tatikios insisted that he only meant to retrieve supplies, after which he would return to Antioch. Few Crusaders believed him. In February, a Turkish army, LED by Ridwan of Aleppo, moved toward Antioch via the Iron Bridge. Bowman, LED, a contingent against them, and through a brilliantly timed cavalry charge, defeated them. The victory boosted Crusader morale, and with the arrival of spring warmth, an English fleet appeared off the coast of St. Simeon, carrying much-needed provisions and supplies. Also, lavish gifts of horses and weapons arrived from Odessa, now a Latin state under Godfrey's brother Baldwin. Throughout the siege, Bowman, who spoke fluent Greek, and made it a point to personally patrol the walls of Antioch. He often conversed with guards on the towers, and by April, he had established contact with one, Feruz, an Armenian convert to Islam. According to the Jew, eventually, Feruz agreed to betray his tower to the Crusaders, and he and Bowman began to secretly arrange a plan. Meanwhile, reports began to reach the Christian camp of an enormous Turkish army led by one Kerbal Ga, the Atabag of Mosul, advancing now to relieve Antioch. News of care about God's approach spread dread among the Crusader forces. Finally, after languishing all winter outside Antioch, were they to be smashed against the walls by care about God's army? Full Care of Charteau recounts how one of the Christian army's primary Latin leaders was so disturbed that he withdrew from the siege. Then, Stephen, Count of Blue, all left the siege and went home to France by sea. We all grieved on his account because he was a very noble man. Although Stephen was among the wealthiest of the Crusade's leaders, he had little talent for military matters. His flight from Antioch would in time prove to be an unbearable disgrace on his name. As pressure mounted in the Latin camp, Bowman prepared to set his trap, ever driven by personal ambition. He kept his alliance with Pharaoh's secret and sought to arrange things so that Antioch would be his and his alone. Bowman came to all the leaders, bearing joyful words to them. In this wise, men, most illustrious knights, see how all of us, whether of greater or lesser degree, are in exceeding poverty and misery, and how utterly ignorant we are from what side we will fare better. Therefore, if it seems good and honorable to you, let one of us put himself ahead of the rest, and if he can acquire or contrive the capture of the city by any plan or scheme by himself, or through the help of others, let us, with one voice, grant him the city as a gift. The grim old Count Ramon of Toulouse immediately objected to this, insisting that Antioch belong to Alexis Comnenus and no other bowman. In his characteristic loud bravado, reminded the council that Alexius's troops had abandoned them, and there was no sign that the emperor intended to help them further. In any way by now, the other leaders had come to trust Bowman, and with good reason. Although the least wealthy of the princes, the Norman's talents had carried the day when all had seemed lost, and thus he had essentially become the leading figure in the Council of Lords, and by now everyone understood that Bowman's personal ambition could always be trusted. Raymond, despite being the richest of the leaders, was outvoted. The other lords agreed to Bowman's plan. Bowman dramatically announced that very shortly Antioch would be Christian again, and with that departed the council. It's safe to assume that probably all the lords, even Ramon, believed him, having secured the loyalty of the Armenian guard Pharaohs on one of Antioch's towers. Bowman organized the whole of the Christian army in a ruse to fool the Turkish garrison and gain control of the city on the afternoon of June 2nd. A large detachment of Crusader infantry and cavalry marched away from Antioch in plain view of the garrison. The Muslim troops on the walls were meant to believe that the Crusaders were sending off a substantial forging expedition, and thus they should not expect any major offensives anytime soon. However, under cover of darkness on the night of June the 3rd, the Crusaders snuck back toward the city and took up positions in hiding just beyond the walls, awaiting boom and signal. Byzantine Princess Anna Kamina explains how Bowman, by sneaking up to the wall below Firuz's tower, sprung his trap. Bowman immediately went off to the tower. The Armenian, according to his agreement, opened the gates. Bowman climbed at once with his followers to the top of the tower as fast as he could. Within minutes, Bowman and his troops had complete control of the Rus's tower. This allowed Bowman to dispatch squadrons throughout the city to kill more patrolling guards and open the main city gates on signal of a trumpet blast from one of Bowman's knights. On Firuz's tower, Godfrey Bouillon and Robert of Flanders rushed into the city with their troops. There followed a brutal sack in which Crusaders and native Greek and Armenian Christians spread throughout the city, killing the Seljuks and capturing booty for the Greeks and Armenians. This was a moment of vengeance in which they vented years of restrained anger at Antioch's occupiers. Thomas Asbridge explains that in those crucial first few minutes, the combination of surprise The confusion of darkness and fear of the Crusaders, unrestrained brutality, paralyzed the defenders. Yagi, seeing himself in a panic, fled the city via the Iron Gate, but was thrown from his horse and left for dead by his companions. There, lying bleeding on the ground, the Turkish emir was discovered by some Armenians, decapitating the city's fallen governor. The Armenians took the head to Bowman, who promptly rewarded them. Bowman had already raised up his blood-red banner over the city walls, and Ramon of Toulouse occupied the city's lavish Greek palace by the morning of June the 4th. It was over. The Crusaders had control of the city, with each of the major leaders holding various portions of the walls. Only the citadel on the top of the mountain remained in Muslim hands, barricaded by the last survivors of the garrison in a desperate last attempt to escape death. Bowman, however, had taken a position with his troops just outside the citadel and was intent on wresting it from the last Turkish defenders. Thus ended the siege of Antioch. After 8 grueling months, the Crusaders had captured the most important city in Syria, and they had done it completely without Byzantine help. Indeed, the Byzantines had withdrawn from the siege instead. It was Bowman's abilities which had delivered Antioch into Christian hands. Baldwin of Bologna's capture of Odessa proved helpful to the Crusaders in another way as well. On his way to Antioch, the Turkish Atabag of Mosul, Karabakh, stopped for 3 days to besiege Odessa, delaying his progress. When he failed at this task, the Turk continued on, intent on destroying the Crusader army camped outside of Antioch. The Crusaders had already captured Antioch, and by the time Carbayocca's forces began to arrive before Antioch's walls on June the 5th, the Crusaders had already firmly established themselves within the city. Only the citadel on Mount Silpius remained in Turkish hands, and this care about God bolstered with a garrison of his own. The army care about God commanded was awesome to behold, so large, in fact, that it could fully blockade the city. Antioch had just been through a months-long siege, and so food was scarce within her powerful walls, penned in by care about God's troops. The Crusaders once again faced the very real prospect of starvation. Meanwhile, far away in Anatolia, another sizable army was on its way to Antioch. This one Byzantine, and headed by Emperor Alexius Comnenus, who had finally elected to bring aid to his beleaguered Latin allies. However, at Philomelion, the emperor encountered one Stephen, Count of Blair, who had fled Antioch just before its fall. Stephen, eager to justify his premature departure from the fight, assured Alexius that the whole Christian army had already been destroyed, and thus the cause of the crusade completely lost. Alexius was perhaps a little too eager to trust Stephen's word, and quickly elected to abandon his mission together. The Byzantine emperor and the Count of Blue each picked up and headed back for the safety of Constantinople. Meanwhile, from the walls of Antioch, the Crusaders, under the de facto leadership of Bowman, were gazing down at the enormous army of Carabalgier and folding them like the coils of a serpent. It seemed incredible that after their astounding capture of the powerfully fortified city, Christ warriors should perish all the same within their prize. Naturally, everyone in the army was looking toward Bowman, the man who time and time again had carried the day. For a solution, the Norman giant was weighing his options carefully and already formulating a plan to defeat the mighty Kabulka. Meanwhile, the desperation of the situation caused many Crusaders to to pray for a miracle, one southern French priest, called Peter Bartholomew, approached Count Ramon of Toulouse with tales of a vision from St. Andrew. The St. Peter insisted, had assured him that buried somewhere beneath Antioch's magnificent Cathedral of St. Peter was the lance that had been used at Calvary to pierce the side of Christ. If the Crusaders found this relic and carried it into battle against Caraboga, God would grant them victory. Although many were skeptical of Peter's story, others were convinced by it. Among them, the pious old Count Ramon, who on June 15th began an excavation beneath the altar of St. Peter's Cathedral. Peter himself was among those digging in the dirt. At one point, Peter cried out and scrambled out of the hole, holding an old iron shard and shouting that he discovered the precious relic. News of Peter's discovery exploded throughout the city. A few skeptics remained, such as Bishop Adamora of Le Puy, but for the average ranking-file soldier, this could be nothing but a sign from God. Considering the gravity of the situation, it was exactly what the Crusaders needed. Morale was boosted, and the weary, hungry Christian soldiers were convinced now that they would indeed triumph over care about God's hordes. Whatever Peter Bartholomew pulled out of the hole in St. Peter's that day, there can be no doubt of the spiritual impact on the Christian soldiers. It came at the right time as well, for the leaders of the army had decided on a very daring and dangerous strategy, a full-on battle with Kerbalcom. Careful, God's troops were numerous, and its position strong. But within the Turkish forces, there were internal division. Between Gilis emirs, says historian Thomas Madden, citing the potential fractiousness of Careful God's vast coalition army. Nevertheless, the Turkish Atabeg seemed poised to capture Antioch and destroy the Christian forces inside. By late June, Count Ramonan, Toulouse was ill, and thus it fell to Bowman alone to lead the upcoming counterattack against Kerbal GA. In choosing to confront Kerbal GA head-on, the Crusaders face several enormous challenges. For one, Kerbal GA's army greatly outnumbered them. Also, the Turks had plenty of horses, while the Crusaders by now had no more than 200 horses of military quality remaining. The majority of their troops would have to fight on foot, but Bowman also understood that the Crusaders, who had survived up to this point, had been hardened into a battle-tested, efficient fighting force. The trials of war had bound them with the brotherhood of soldiers who have long fought shoulder to shoulder. Bowman's battle plan was astounding, writes historian Thomas Asbridge. Its execution, exceptional. Bowman chose the bridge gate for the selling point, placing the Latins on the western bank of the Orontes, preventing the Turkish troops on the eastern bank from quickly engaging them. First to emerge from the city was a division of archers under Hugh of Vermond Noir, which hammered the Turks with arrows, driving back the first line of Muslim troops and opening a space for the remainder of the Crusader army to deploy. Bowman had divided the remainder of the army into 5 distinct divisions to provide cohesion in the midst of battle. Once the bridge gate had been cleared, the northern French under Robert of Flanders and Robert of Normandy emerged in column behind Hugh's archers and then maneuvered to his left. Next, Godfrey Bouillon marched out with his Lotharingians and Germans, followed by Bishop Adamar, leading the southern French. Each division fanned out left in a semicircle, with Bowman commanding the largest and final contingent, allowing him to bring aid to any portion of the army that came under heavy attack. Thomas Asbridge calls this disposition of the troops the finest expression of Bowman's military genius. But despite this well-ordered deployment, had Kerpega reacted differently? The Crusaders might have been crushed as they came out of Antioch once he realized that the Crusaders were sailing forth from the bridge gate. Kerpega had two options: immediately attack with his main force or wait and meet them in battle on grounds of his own choosing. In that, Kerpega chose the latter, probably because he did not judge the ragged Crusader army to be much of a threat. Had he launched an immediate attack, he could have inflicted heavy losses, but he also would have ended the battle before the Christians were fully deployed. No doubt the bulk of their numbers would have retreated, and many might not have even deployed at all. Instead, Kerpega chose to allow the Franks to bring the whole of their army out of Antioch, thus giving him the opportunity to crush them completely in one grand stroke. This would allow him to avoid a long siege, but this does not mean the Crusaders were able to march unmolested out of Antioch, while Kerpega's main force held back the Crusaders as they struggled to get into position before the bridge gate were attacked fiercely by the advanced Turkish troops. There was a vicious counterattack from the Turks, who had been guarding the bridge gate, followed almost instantly by an assault from the Turks, sweeping down from positions before the gate of St. Paul and the gate of the Duke, most pressing of all Turks' position before the gate of St. George, quickly began crossing the river and coming up behind the Crusaders for an attack. The Christians were surrounded militarily. This was a near impossible situation to survive. A small infantry-based army, while attempting to deploy out of a narrow gate, was being heavily attacked from all sides by enemy cavalry. At this crucial moment, the Crusaders, by now tested in countless battles against the Turks, rose to the challenge. The knight Reynard of Toul was dispatched with a contingent of French and Lotharingians, and they met the southeastern attack with such ferocity that the enemy broken and panicked. Meanwhile, the main body of the Franks held formation against the onslaught of Turkish arrows, just as they had done at Dori Lam, unbroken by the Turkish onslaught and united as a solid, impenetrable body of infantry. The Crusaders now marched forward, fighting with precision and ferocity before this powerful counterattack. The Turkish advanced guard utterly broke, turning tail and fleeing. Kerpega, realizing what was going on, began a rushed, panicked advance and ran right into his own retreating troops. This caused more Turkish units to break off and retreat. Meanwhile, the Crusader infantry continued their advance, shattering the Turkish formations with brutal efficiency. It wasn't long before the entire Turkish coalition was in full flight, with Kerpega himself barely escaping with his life. It was over. A tiny army of weary, hungry Christian soldiers had utterly shattered an enormous, well-equipped Turkish army. Within hours, the Turkish troops inside the citadel surrendered to Bowman, and now the whole of Antioch truly was securely in Christian hands. It was an astounding victory, probably the most important of the First Crusade. Now, the way lay open for the march on the ultimate prize, Jerusalem. Following their defeat of Garbuka, the Crusaders controlled a wealthy stretch of territory from Edessa to Antioch and the important port city of St. Simeon. But since the army was according to full care of Charter, wearied by many days of arduous labor, the Council of Leaders decided not to march on Jerusalem until November the 1st for the remainder of 1098. The Franks settled into Antioch, consecrating churches and dispatching parties of knights to subdue nearby fortresses. Bohemund, who occupied the citadel, essentially acted as Antioch's prince, in accordance with the council's decision. During the siege, there had been one stipulation to that agreement, however, that Bohemund could only rule Antioch so long as Emperor Alexius did not come to claim her. Alexius had failed to bring aid to the Crusaders during their desperate standoff with Kerbal Ga, despite his daughter Anna's claim that the emperor was much concerned to bring help personally to the Celts. After Bohemund's brilliant defeat of the enormous Turkish army, all the army's leaders were quite content for him to have the city, all that is, except for Count Ramon. Ramon continued to insist that Alexius had not been given sufficient opportunity to claim Antioch. He convinced the council that one final attempt should be made to offer the city to the Byzantines. The army's leaders selected Hugh of Armondois to lead an embassy to Constantinople to request that the emperor come and claim Antioch. Meanwhile, Bohemund would continue to act as Antioch's prince. In August, the army suffered a devastating loss. Bishop Adama, the spiritual father of the crusade, revered by all, fell ill and died. Ralph of Gon, a follower of Tancred's, describes Adama as a man of great merit and a man worthy of honor. In any place, Adama was so respected by both Bohemund and Ramon that he was often the only voice in the army that could mediate between the two. As the months wore on and the leaders began planning the march on Jerusalem, Bohemund and Raymond's disagreements continued. There was still no word from Alexius, and Bohemund was busily establishing his new state, the Principality of Antioch. It became clear that the Norman prince had no intention of joining in the march on Jerusalem. Ramon insisted that Bohemund keep his vow to participate in Jerusalem's capture. Ramon even promised to accept Bohemund's rule in Antioch if the Norman would swear to aid in the campaign for Jerusalem. Bohemund agreed to this. November 1st came and went, and the army remained stalled in Antioch, with a Bohemund still unwilling to march on the holy city regardless of his earlier promise. Ramon, for his part, hesitated to withdraw from Antioch and thereby guarantee Bohemund total control of the city. By now, the common soldiers, eager to fulfill their vows at Jerusalem, were quite impatient with their leaders. Delays, everyone understood that Bohemund would never move his forces out of Antioch, and so the ordinary soldiers began to press Ramon to lead them to Christ's city. Who else? But he could guide them to Jerusalem. They asked Ramon, was an old man at the time of his departure for the East. He had been one of the wealthiest lords in Europe. Perhaps only piety explains why such a man could forsake all that for the perils of crusade. Now pressed by the common pilgrims of the Christian army, the aged count at last relented in his long struggle with Bohemund. On January 13th, 1099, Count Ramon of Toulouse, barefoot, unarmed, and carrying a pilgrim staff, departed Antioch at the head of the army, adopting the guise of an ordinary pilgrim. As a statement about the true purpose of the crusade, following him was the whole of the Christian host singing psalms, rejoicing that at last they journeyed to Jerusalem. Only Bohemund, in the bulk of his Normans, remained behind in Antioch, though a small Norman contingent under Bohemund's nephew Tancred did accompany Ramon. With Ramon of Toulouse in the lead, The Christian army traveled south through Syria. Along the way, they encountered Saracen fortresses, which sent out tribute payments and provisions in exchange for being left unmolested by the now famous destroyers of Karbala. Many of these small Muslim statelets were in rebellion against the Emir of Damascus and other Turkish princes, and thus were keen to remain neutral. Additionally, Palestine was now in the hands of the Fatimids, a Shiite Egyptian-based empire, so the Seljuks and Damascus had no interest in hindering the Frankish advance, sworn enemies of the Sunni Seljuk Turks. The Fatimids had kept track of the Crusaders' progress and had even sent embassies to them, offering to collaborate against the Turks, so long as the Franks agreed not to attack Jerusalem. Fatimids did not yet grasp, but the Christian army would settle for nothing less than control of the Holy City on May 1999. The Crusaders entered Fatimid territory. They marched along the coast, passing the ports of Beirut, Sidon, Tyre and Acre, all willing to offer supplies in trade for peace. The Crusaders obliged, and by June 3rd, they reached the inland road just north of Jaffa, which led to the Holy City. News arrived that a Fatimid army was now mobilizing in Egypt. The Christians were undeterred. They veered inland, confident that if they maintained faith, God would provide victory. By June 6th, the Crusaders reached Bethlehem, an entirely Christian city, which welcomed the army as liberators. The following day, the Franks climbed the famous hill of Mount Joy, the point on the road at which Jerusalem becomes visible. The Latin sources emphasized the elation of the pilgrims at this first sighting of the Holy City. Tancred, riding ahead with a scouting party, was one of the first atop Mount Joy, and Ralph of Gon describes his reaction getting his first glimpse of Jerusalem from a distance. Tancred greeted her, placed his knees on the ground, his heart on heaven. The chaplain of Ramon of Toulouse describes how the Franks organized the siege. Duke Godfrey in the Count of Flanders and the Duke of Normandy besieged the city from the north side. From the Church of St. Stephen, located in the center of the city, southward, to the angular tower next to the Tower of David, Count Ramon and his army, however, settled down on the western side and besieged Jerusalem from the camp of the Duke to the foot of Mount Zion. The Crusaders didn't have the numbers for a full encirclement, and the city was strongly fortified amid rocky, harsh terrain. The Fatimid governor, Iftikhar, had expelled all of Jerusalem's Christian inhabitants, since the story of Antioch's betrayal was also well known. Local cisterns had been poisoned or spoiled, and water was scarce. Jerusalem's Christians joined the Crusaders in their camp, confirming the rumors of an Egyptian army on the way to relieve the Holy City. Faced with little time, the Franks decided on a bold, all-out assault on the city. On June 13th, the Christian troops stormed Jerusalem's walls, but they were quickly beaten back by the Fatima defenders. Thomas Madden says that the Crusaders lacked sufficient scaling ladders and siege machinery to threaten seriously Jerusalem's towering walls. The city of Jerusalem is located in a mountainous region which is devoid of trees. Wrote full care of Chartres, meaning the Crusader army had no timber for the building of siege engines. However, shortly after the failure of the first assault on the city, a fleet of Genoese and English ships loaded with building materials arrived at Java, having responded to earlier pleas for aids sent back to the west. Seeing in this God's blessing, the Latin set to constructing catapults, ladders, and towers. It was hard labor in the Palestinian sun, but they worked briskly, for, as the chronicler Ibn al-Qalanasi wrote, news reached them that Al-Afdal, the Fatimid vizier, was on his way from Egypt with a mighty army to engage in the jihad against them, and by early July, the Crusaders had completed their machinery and were ready for a proper assault on the city. But first, the leaders announced that they would invoke God's aid on July 8th. The army, barefoot and bearing relics, processed around the walls of Jerusalem singing prayers. The Fatimids, watching from Jerusalem's ramparts, shouted jeers of the Christians and defiled crosses and icons taken from the city's churches. The Crusaders finally stopped the Mount of Olives, the site of Christ's ascension to heaven. Here, they offered final prayers that God would grant them victory at dawn on July 14th. Trumpets blasted through the Crusader camp, announcing the commencement of the assault. The Muslims inside the city immediately rushed to the walls for the defense, but as they gazed down over the ramparts, they realized that the Westerners had staged an ingenious ruse for weeks. Godfrey Bouillon's contingent had busily built siege equipment before Jerusalem's powerful quadrangular tower. The Saracens had responded by working just as hard to bolster the fortifications of that already strong section. But now, the Fatimids found that overnight, Godfrey's men had dismantled all their machinery, moved it 1 kilometer to a point just east of St. Stephen's Gate, and reassembled the siege engines there. This was an incredible feat of physical endurance for a single night. The Saracens were stunned and terrified, for the portion of the wall, now swarming with Crusader siege equipment, was the weakest point in Jerusalem's defenses. Fighting raged all of July 14th, with Count Ramon's army managing to bring their siege tower close to the city. Although fierce resistance from the Fatimids prevented Ramon's men from actually capturing the wall, however, on the morning of July 15th, Godfrey's tower was successfully brought up against the city. Godfrey's knights, Ludolf and Engelberg, were the first to enter Jerusalem, followed quickly by Godfrey and more of his men. It was a crucial moment, with Godfrey fighting alongside his knights in a desperate battle to secure the wall. They captured the gate of the column, which Godfrey ordered opened, allowing the whole of the Crusader army to rush into the city fathom, and resistance collapsed as the Christians spread throughout Jerusalem. Thomas Madden writes that by the standards of the time adhered to by both Christians and Muslims, the Crusaders would have been justified in putting the entire population of Jerusalem to the sword. Despite later, highly exaggerated reports, however, that is not what happened. It's true that many of the inhabitants, both Muslims and Jews, were killed in the initial fray, yet many were also allowed to purchase their freedom, or were simply expelled from the city. Tancred and the Normans drove deep into the city's heart, where they plundered the Temple Mount Iftikhar, and the high-ranking Fatimid officers took refuge in the Tower of David, which they surrendered to Count Ramon, who protected their lives, and later provided them with safe passage back to Egypt. The Crusaders had done it. Pope Urban's dream had come true. A Latin army had reclaimed Jerusalem for Christendom. The chaplain of Raymond of Toulouse writes, now that the city was taken, it was well worth all our previous labors and hardships to see the devotion of the pilgrims of the Holy Sepulchre, how they rejoiced and exulted and sang a new song to the Lord. It was the crowning moment for the Crusaders to kneel in prayer before the tomb of Christ. But although they had captured Jerusalem, the Christian host still had to deal with a large Egyptian army on its way to reverse their victory. The Crusaders acted quickly to secure the newly conquered Jerusalem. On July 22nd, 1099, Godfrey of Bouillon was elected defender of the Holy Sepulchre, ruler of the nascent Kingdom of Jerusalem. It is popularly believed that Count Ramon IV of Toulouse was unhappy with Godfrey's election, but historians John and Loretta Hill conclude that Ramon very likely concurred in Godfrey's appointment as defender of Jerusalem. Soon, word arrived from Tancred, who was scouting the southern coast, that indeed a Fatimid army at Ascalon was preparing to march on Jerusalem. Godfrey's response was to rally the Christian forces to the offensive, while the Latin and Greek clergy gathered together in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre to pray for victory. Godfrey, along with the forces of Robert of Flanders, marched south, rendezvous at Romla with the armies of Ramon of Toulouse and Robert of Normandy, as well as Tancred, who had captured Nablus earlier that month. The newly elected Patriarch Arnulf carried the relic of the true cross at the head of the Christian host. Al-Afdal, the Egyptian vizier, had assembled a massive army made up of troops from all over the Fatimid Caliphate. He camped in the plain of Al-Mashdal, just outside of Ashkelon, with the plan of next marching on Jerusalem to drive out the Franks. He was unaware that the Crusaders were already on the move. Godfrey and Ramon divided their forces into 9 divisions, then rapidly advanced on the Fatimid position on August 12th. The Fatimids were caught unaware when the Crusaders attacked. Unlike the Turks, the Fatimas did not employ large numbers of mounted archers, and their lance-wielding Arab and Berber cavalry, which moved closely with their inventory, offered a solid target for the devastating Frankish cavalry charge. Historian R.C. Smale says that the charge alone secured a Latin victory, and the best sources agree that the duration of the battle was brief. Olaf Dole's troops scattered, and as full care of Chartres writes, in the sweeping attack, the Saracens perished on all sides. The entire Egyptian camp, filled with horses and provisions, was captured by the Christians. It's commonly believed that in the aftermath of their defeat, the Fatimids at Ashkelon offered to surrender the city to the Crusaders, but a quarrel erupted between Ramon and Godfrey over who would possess it. The Fatimids, hearing of this quarrel, broke off negotiations, and Ashkelon was lost to the Crusaders. The source of this tale comes from Ralph of Caen and Albert of Aachen, neither of whom were present at the battle, and both of whom were biased against Count Ramon. Our best Saracen source, Ibn al-Qalanisi, offers a very different account. The Franks besieged Ashkelon, until at length the townsmen agreed to pay them 20,000 dinars as protection money, and to deliver this sum to them forth, with they therefore set about collecting this amount from the inhabitants of the town. But it befell that a quarrel broke out between the Frankish leaders, and they retired without having received any of the money. Ibn al-Qalanisi, unimpacted by the various regional loyalties of the Latin chroniclers, is probably our best source for this incident. He says nothing about a specific quarrel between Godfrey and Ramon, just that some sort of disagreement resulted in a failure to collect tribute from Ashkelon, but not a missed opportunity to actually possess the city itself. An offer of total surrender of Ascalon at this stage seems questionable at best, as the city was well fortified. The disagreement may have been, as John and Loretta Hill point out, that most Crusaders considered their vows fulfilled and were not interested in aiding the leaders in a full-on siege of the Egyptian city. The Crusader victory at Ashkelon meant that Jerusalem was secure as a Christian possession. With the Holy City secured, Godfrey Bouillon ruled a tiny Latin outpost, surrounded by hostile Muslim neighbors. Over the next 2 decades, the Kingdom of Jerusalem would expand dramatically through relentless conquests of the surrounding territories. For now, Godfrey and only 300 knights committed themselves to the defense of Jerusalem, while the bulk of the army returned home to Europe. A similar process began in the north, in the newly founded Principality of Antioch and County of Edessa in December of 1099. The rulers of these 2 states, Prince Bowman and Count Baldwin, traveled to Jerusalem to celebrate Christmas with Godfrey and to worship at the Holy Sepulchre. Meanwhile, Robert of Flanders, Robert of Normandy, and Ramon, the Fourth of Toulouse, returned to Constantinople, where Emperor Alexius, the first Comnenus, received them as heroes and hosted lavish feasts in their honor, while the 2 Roberts returned to Europe. Aymon IV ultimately returned to Outremarre to lay the groundwork for the 4th Crusader state, the County of Tripoli, which would exist between the Principality of Antioch and the Kingdom of Jerusalem. News of Jerusalem's liberation spread across Europe throughout the Latin world. People celebrated the restoration of the Holy Sepulchre. Returning Crusaders were welcomed as heroes, their stories immortalized in songs in the coming decades. Pilgrims from every corner of Europe would make the long journey to the now Christian-ruled Jerusalem, where they could worship safely at the Holy Sepulchre. The First Crusades' triumph solidified. In the minds of Latins, this new concept of the Crusade, a war waged with the blessing of the Church, not for the selfish petty reasons, but in the cause of Christendom. In March of 1095, Pope Urban II completed a tour of France and Italy by holding council in Piacenza. In March of 1095, Pope Urban II completed a tour of France and Italy by holding council in Piacenza in Lombardy. Here, ambassadors from the Byzantine Emperor Alexius Comnenus appealed to the Pope for Western military carry aid. The Seljuk Turks had seized control of most of Anatolia and were on the doorstep of Constantinople. It's hard to discern precisely what Alexius